Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Director, as Mr. Sensenbrenner did, I'd want to thank you for your service over the years to our country. I also want to disclose that I happen to represent Cincinnati, Ohio, where some of the allegations, apparently rogue employees who were allegedly acting on their own were originated. But my questions, let me begin with this. The IRS, of course, is privy to some of our citizens' most sensitive information, and it's tasked with applying the law in a fair and impartial way. You would agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. However, the members of a Tea Party group in my district received a letter asking some pretty invasive questions, I believe, providing all their Facebook and Twitter information, for example, any of their advertising. They specifically mentioned a gentleman by the name of Justin Binnick Thomas, although it says Bink, B-I-N-K, it's actually B-I-N-I-K, I believe. It was just an ordinary citizen who didn't have any connection with that particular organization that received this inquiry from the IRS. And he also got no notification in that matter at all. They also got questions about providing a list of all the issues that were important to that organization, and they wanted to know what their position was regarding each issue. And I'm very concerned about the IRS's admitting targeting conservative groups and this overly invasive line of questioning and requests for information. It's really, I believe, more like harassment rather than an appropriate inquiry under 501c4 status inquiries. Now, the Attorney General announced back on May 14th that he had ordered an investigation by the FBI. Has the FBI begun that investigation now?
Yes.
Okay. And I assume that you can't go into the details of that because it's an ongoing investigation. Am I correct on that?
Correct.
Okay. Now, the IRS Commissioner, Stephen Mueller, initially blamed these actions, as I said, on two rogue employees way out there at the Cincinnati office. So how could we possibly know anything about that here in Washington, basically? And he acted like nobody here in this city knew anything about it or was connected in any way with it. That's become pretty clear at this point that the IRS in Washington was involved in this. I'd like to read a couple of things here relative to Elizabeth Hoffaker, who was one of the Cincinnati employees, and some of the things that she has indicated on the record. She said that the Tea Party cases, the Patriot cases, those types of organizations that were questioned by the IRS, that they were basically in a holding pattern, their applications. She indicated that they were basically in a black hole. She had been working for 11 years at the IRS, and she said the way the IRS handled the Tea Party cases was unprecedented. So unprecedented, which I think is pretty significant. She said it was micromanaged to death by an IRS lawyer who worked in Washington. Again, no Washington connection, of course, but that's where this IRS lawyer was, here in Washington, D.C. And back in July 2010, the IRS developed what was called a BOLO list. Do you know what a BOLO list is?
No, sir. Okay.
Well, it stands for Be on the Lookout. BOLO, Be on the Lookout. And it instructed agents.
I knew BOLO in the law enforcement context. I didn't know whether you're using it in that context.
Yeah, it was used in that context to send Hoffaker applications from organizations involved with the Tea Party movement. And she told congressional investigators that she understood the purpose of the list was to target conservative and Republican groups. Other political groups did not get handled the same way, according to her. And a USA Today review of tax exemptions granted at the time showed dozens of liberal groups got exemptions while Tea Party groups were on hold. And subsequently, there was another BOLO criteria that came down from D.C. Talking about including groups whose issues include government spending, government debt and taxes, and if you're critical of the country or the direction that it's going or the way it's being run. And again, a lot of these things sat in limbo for 27 months. Will all these matters be investigated by the FBI, no matter how high up they go?
I can't specifically assert that all will. To the extent that there is any indication of criminal misconduct, we will follow the leads and the evidence wherever it takes us.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Mueller, for your service over the years. I think you've raised the standard very high, and I appreciate that. I want to follow up on in a response that you made to a question that Mr. Conyers gave. You used the phrase that you thought the American people were concerned about, to what end the programs, these two programs, are being used. And I think that is absolutely the case. I think that was the case when we were debating the Patriot Act and the reauthorization of it, and the concerns that a number of us were raising at that time was, to what end would these programs be used? Congressman Scott has questioned you about some of those ends, and what I want to do is frame this based on the four things that you mentioned in your opening statement. You talked about terrorism, you talked about national security, you talked about cybersecurity, and you talked about criminal activity. In your description of cybersecurity, and you said that that required public-private interaction, and all of these things have become more global, I take it. All four of those categories have become more global. So the question I'm raising is there a distinction between terrorism, the purposes for which information can be used in these programs for terrorism purposes? That's why the statutes were put in place. Is there a distinction between terrorism and national security?
I think terrorism as defined is a threat to national security in and of itself. A terrorist act is a threat to...
Does national security include, or does national security include some things outside terrorism?
Include the what?
Some things that are outside the category of terrorism.
Terrorism is a separate category, but you have cyber terrorists, you have individuals, and one of the concerns we have, quite obviously, in the future.
What about trade? Trade is a matter of national security, I take it.
Well, I can tell you I mean, one of the hypotheticals is a terrorist attack, cyber terrorist attack on Wall Street. That is trade. To the extent that you disrupt.
That's trade.
Disrupt that, then absolutely that's a matter of national security.
So I think what you were right, that the public's concern here is, what is the overlap between these four categories, and to what extent can this information that is being gathered be used for things that are in the gray areas here. I was uncomfortable that we got so preoccupied with terrorism that we compromised, I thought, personal liberties, but assume that we got comfortable with that after 9/11. What if you found something in this information that's gathered under these two programs that related more to criminal activity, serious criminal activity? The question is, can that be used? Anything you find in these phone dragnets, can it be used in a criminal investigation if you decide that it's not terrorist related necessarily, but could be national security related or cyber security related. What is the dividing line between the use of these things other than an individual agent's discretion or whatever an individual agent represents in an affidavit to the court?
Let me start by the use of the word dragnet. I do not believe.
I'm sorry.
I just want to clarify.
And I didn't intend to use it either. I really apologize. It's data gathering.
It's data gathering.
Yeah.
It is not
okay.
content. The statute is fairly specific that it's attributable to terrorism, and the traditional, what one would understand to be terrorism, Al Qaeda and its like, and other terrorist groups that are specifically mentioned. As I tried to point out before, the program is set up for a very limited purpose in a limited objective, and that is to identify individuals in the United States who are using a telephone for terrorist activities and to draw that network.
Is cyber terrorism? Is cyber terrorism?
Sniper?
Cyber.
Cyber, it can be, but not as distinguished. I'd have to look at that, but I don't believe it would be covered in this particular statute. I tried to leave out the possibility that if there were a piece of evidence that was applicable to a homicide or substantial, the only way for that piece to be utilized would go back to the court and get the approval of the court to utilize this information in a way that was not covered in the original order.
Time of the gentleman has expired.